Welcome to the deep dive. You guys sent in a whole bunch of YouTube videos about some seriously intense killers: Chris Watts, Jeffrey Dahmer, Ed Kemper, and Ted Bundy. So get ready, because we're about to go deep, deep, deep into the minds of some of history's most notorious criminals.
Yeah, it's fascinating, really, like what makes these guys tick, you know? It's a scary thought, but we're going to explore things like psychopathy and manipulation, nature versus nurture, the whole thing, and how they flew under the radar for so long.
Okay, let's start with Chris Watts, the family annihilator, as some call him. I mean, remember those news interviews right after? He seemed so harmless, just begging for his family to come home safe. Then, bam, the truth hits us like a ton of bricks. What do you think about that whole facade? Like, how can someone be so two-faced?
It's a big part of the Chris Watts story, that's for sure. The grieving husband act, the note he writes a week before saying he never hurt his family. But here's the kicker. You read his prison letters, and it's like, whoa, totally different dude.
It's insane, right?
Yeah.
Like, he was living a double life. In those letters, he talks about, fantasizing about killing Shanann.
Mm-hmm.
And the way he describes the murders of his daughters, it's chilling, like he's talking about the weather or something. And then there's that Google search. What does it feel like when someone says, "I love you"? Seriously, what's that all about?
Right. It's messed up. That search, plus him admitting he gave Shanann OxyContin, hoping to end the pregnancy, wanting to be with his mistress, Nicole, and all that. It just screams emotional disconnect, you know? And he had a seemingly normal childhood, so it makes you wonder where things went wrong.
It gets even more complex, though, right? Because then there's his parents going after the life insurance payout. It just adds another layer of awful to an already horrific story.
Absolutely. It shows how far-reaching the impact of these crimes really is, like a ripple effect of pain and ethical dilemmas. You can't just contain it.
Okay, so we've got this seemingly average guy turned killer, and now we're moving on to, well, Jeffrey Dahmer. Completely different, but still pure evil. His case is all about obsession and control taken to the absolute darkest extreme. Murder, necrophilia, cannibalism. It's hard to even process it all.
It's true, but it's important to remember Dahmer didn't just suddenly become a monster. It was gradual. A troubled childhood, yeah, but also a fascination with dead animals from a young age, and then it just escalated. Fantasies turning into actions, step by step. It's a scary look into how criminal paraphilia can develop.
Now, hold on a sec. For people who might not know what paraphilia means, it's basically when someone has really intense sexual interests that are outside the norm. And that BuzzFeed Unsolved Network video did a great job of explaining that, not all paraphilias are criminal. Some are just, well, unusual, I guess.
That's an important distinction. Not everyone with unusual interests is going to become a Dahmer. It's when those interests cross the line and turn into harmful actions that things get really dangerous.
And his actions were horrifying, no doubt. That apartment altar drawing, for example. His whole fantasy of making his victims a part of him so they could never leave. It's terrifying.
That drawing is a window into Dahmer's mind, right? Total power and control. That's what he craved. He wanted connection, sure, but in this sick, twisted way. And that macabre scenario, that's where he found it. No chance of rejection there.
And there's this crazy perspective from Dr. Hickey, who interviewed Dahmer. He said that even though the things Dahmer did were brutal, he never intended to cause suffering. He just wanted the unrejecting presence, as he put it, of corpses.
It makes you think, doesn't it? Does the lack of intent to cause suffering somehow make Dahmer less of a monster? Or does the nature of his actions, regardless of motivation, define him? It's something to think about.
It's definitely disturbing. Like Chris Watts, Dahmer hid his true self behind this facade of normalcy. But the darkness simmering beneath the surface, man, it's truly chilling. Speaking of facades, Ed Kemper, the co-ed killer, is another fascinating case. And he reminds us that even intelligence can be a dangerous weapon.
Oh, yeah. Kemper's high IQ was like a tool he used to plan and carry out those awful crimes. And his story is a prime example of how messed up childhood trauma can be, especially a toxic relationship with a mother.
That murder, mayhem, and malice intent video really got into the details of his childhood. Forced isolation in the basement, constant emotional and verbal abuse from his mom.
And you know what gets me? After he killed his mom, he spent like an hour yelling at her severed head. It's like he was finally trying to make her shut up to silence that voice that had been torturing him for years.
It's awful, and it really speaks volumes about the rage he must have been carrying around. And then there's the fact that he was able to manipulate psychologists during his time locked up, making them think he was all better. And after he got out, he was even buddies with some of the cops at a local bar.
Yeah.
Crazy, right? all while committing murders. It's nightmare stuff.
Exactly. It shows you just how dangerous the combo of smarts, psychopathy, and unresolved trauma can be. He knew how people worked, and he used that knowledge to hide his true self and do those horrible things.
It's scary, really. It makes you think twice about who you can trust.
Okay, so we've talked about facades, manipulation, and childhood trauma. Let's move on to Ted Bundy. He was the ultimate charming psychopath, wasn't he? Using his looks and that seemingly normal personality to fool his victims.
Oh, for sure. Bundy's case is a textbook example of how powerful deception can be. He played on people's trust, crafting this image of a regular good guy. And that made him even more dangerous because nobody could believe someone like him could be capable of such brutality.
And the guy was meticulous, too, taking advantage of how fragmented law enforcement communication was back in the 70s. He even said, and I quote, "You could kill a person in one county, throw her body in another one, her clothing in a third county." I mean, come on. Talk about calculated.
It wasn't just some random act of rage. It was all planned out, executed perfectly, which just points to a complete lack of empathy and a level of detachment that's really unsettling. And even after he got caught, the manipulation continued. That monster mindset video showed how he convinced his Mormon ward that he was actually innocent, and they rallied around him. How did he keep that act up for so long?
He was good, really good. It wasn't until they found that bite mark evidence, something he couldn't explain away, that the cracks started to show. Bundy's case is a good reminder of how important forensic science is in bringing criminals to justice, no matter how convincing they seem.
So we've gone from meticulously planned murders to impulsive acts, from normal-looking backgrounds to intense childhood trauma. It's amazing to me how these killers, as different as they are, were all able to fool the people around them.
It's true. The ability to compartmentalize, to separate that outward persona from the dark stuff going on inside, is pretty common in these cases. It makes you wonder, can you ever really know someone? And how can you protect yourself from someone who's so good at hiding who they truly are?
It's a scary thought.
Yeah.
And it underscores the importance of, being aware, thinking critically, and trusting your gut. But it's not just about seeing the danger signs. It's also about understanding how someone could become a monster, right?
Exactly. We've seen how things like childhood trauma, being neglected, even how your parents raise you can play a role. Like Chris Watts, remember his parents' interview? They were so dismissive of Shanann and the grandkids. His mom even said she never really liked Shanann, almost like she was glad to be rid of her.
Yeah. And then there's the whole thing from Behind Criminal Minds about them going to court to try and get Shanann's life insurance money. It paints a pretty disturbing picture of their family dynamic.
Right. Makes you wonder what kind of environment Chris was raised in. Now, it's important to remember we're not excusing his actions, but to understand how someone could do something so horrible, you got to look at all the pieces of the puzzle, even the uncomfortable ones.
It brings us back to that age-old question of nature versus nurture. Was Chris Watts always going to be a killer? Or did his environment shape him into one?
It's a question that experts have been wrestling with forever. There's no easy answer, unfortunately. But in Chris Watts' case, you see evidence of both, for sure.
On one hand, you've got those prison letters where he talks about, daydreaming about killing Shanann and feeling nothing when he suffocated his daughters. That could definitely point to some underlying psychopathy.
Right. And the Behind Criminal Minds video pointed out the work of this psychopath expert, H.G. Tudor, who said that a lack of control environment can actually create a psychopath.
And that could be a lot of things, right? Abuse, neglect, even too much praise and thinking a kid can do no wrong.
Exactly. So even though Chris Watts had a seemingly normal childhood, there might have been stuff going on under the surface that contributed to those psychopathic tendencies.
Interesting. It goes against the idea that psychopaths always come from abusive or traumatic backgrounds,
Absolutely. It's important to keep in mind when trying to understand these cases. It's like there's a recipe for making a monster, but the ingredients can be different. You can have abuse and neglect, or you can have this warped sense of entitlement and no accountability, and both can lead to the same outcome. A total disconnect from empathy and remorse.
Pretty chilling, huh?
Yeah.
But we can't ignore it. The more we understand these patterns, the better we can spot the warning signs and hopefully prevent these tragedies from happening again. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about Jeffrey Dahmer. His case is a deep dive into paraphilia, specifically necrophilia and cannibalism.
What's interesting about Dahmer is how open he was about his struggles with his sexuality and that desire to control his victims. He wanted them to be a part of him, physically and emotionally.
So that's where the cannibalism and trying to create zombies comes in, right?
Right.
He wanted to make them permanently part of his world where they could never leave him.
Right. It came from a deep-seated insecurity and lack of self-esteem. Dahmer felt rejected and inadequate in his own life, so he wanted to create this world where he had complete power over his victims.
The BuzzFeed Unsolved Network video really emphasized that Dahmer's descent into darkness was a slow burn. It wasn't like he just woke up one day and decided to become a serial killer. It was gradual, fueled by his fantasies and that inability to connect with people in a healthy way.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be able to see those early warning signs of paraphilia, you know? People need to get help before those fantasies turn into something dangerous.
Agreed. We can't just ignore these things and hope they'll magically disappear. We need to be open and honest about sexuality and mental health.
And part of that is learning about the different kinds of paraphilia, understanding that not all of them are criminal.
That BuzzFeed Unsolved Network video did a good job of explaining that, which is important to remember. And it's crazy how Dahmer managed to avoid getting caught for so long, even with all those close calls. How did he stay off the radar for so long?
It helped that he was so good at blending in, at looking like a regular, unassuming guy. He was smart about it, too, choosing victims who wouldn't be missed as easily and getting rid of their remains carefully.
And remember that part in the video about how he would go to the funerals of young men who had died in accidents or from illnesses, then later dig up their graves to, It's a reminder that these guys' minds just don't work like ours. Their motivations, their desires, how they justify what they do. It's so far removed from our sense of morality, it's almost impossible to understand.
Speaking of evading detection, let's switch to Ed Kemper, the co-ed killer. His case is a textbook example of how manipulative a smart criminal can be.
Kemper's high IQ, along with his understanding of psychology, allowed him to fool the professionals, the people who were supposed to be evaluating him. He convinced them he was all better, even helped with psych tests on other inmates, which just gave him even more insight into how to manipulate the system. It's like he was studying to commit more crimes, learning how to make himself look harmless while he had these dark, violent desires. His intelligence was a tool for his evil side.
It is a scary thought, and it shows how limited our traditional ways of assessing and treating criminals can be. We need better methods, ones that can account for manipulation and deception.
And after he got out, he was charming his way into the good graces of police officers at a bar. He was literally becoming friends with the people who should have been looking for him.
That blew my mind when I heard it in the Murder, Mayhem, and Malice Intent video. These cops who were supposed to be protecting everyone were completely taken in by him.
It's a stark reminder that anyone can be fooled, even the people we trust the most. We have to be careful, really think about who we let into our lives.
Absolutely. And in Kemper's case, that manipulation was fueled by this deep resentment toward his mother.
Yeah, his mother, Clarnell, was toxic, abusive, putting him down all the time, making him feel less than a man, forcing him to live in the basement. It's no surprise he ended up so angry and messed up about power. His childhood was basically a breeding ground for violence.
And it all came to a head when he killed his mother. The brutality of it, bludgeoning her, slitting her throat, then cutting off her head and putting it on display, yelling at it for hours. It's just beyond disturbing. It speaks to a level of psychological torture that's hard to even comprehend.
Throwing darts at her severed head, too.
Yeah.
I mean, what? It's just unreal. It's hard to imagine how anyone could do something so awful to their own mother.
It's a truly horrific scene, and it really shows the lasting impact of childhood trauma and the complexity of the Oedipus complex. Kemper's story reminds us that the roots of violence are often in the past, and that early intervention is so crucial in preventing future tragedies.
It's interesting that both Kemper and Dahmer confessed to their crimes. It's like they finally reached a point where they couldn't keep carrying the weight of their secrets. What do you make of that?
It's definitely worth thinking about. For some of these killers, confessing is a way to find some kind of release, to acknowledge what they've done. It's like they can't stand the guilt and the secrets anymore.
But confession doesn't always mean remorse, right?
You got it. A lot of times, it's more about controlling the story, using it to their advantage. They might confess to avoid a worse punishment or to become famous.
That brings us to our last killer, Ted Bundy. This case is fascinating because it shows how powerful charm and looks can be, how easy it is to be fooled by appearances. Bundy was the ultimate charmer, wasn't he? Manipulating his way into people's lives, often with deadly consequences.
Yeah, Bundy was the whole package. Good-looking, smart, and a smooth talker. He knew how to come across as trustworthy and respectable, which made it easier for him to gain his victims' trust and stay hidden for years. He was like a chameleon, changing his personality to fit whatever situation he was in.
And manipulative, too, even using his law school knowledge to represent himself in court and stall his execution. He was always playing games, trying to control the narrative and use the system to his advantage.
That's right. He knew who the system worked and used it for his own gain. He knew how to act like the victim, how to charm the jury, how to delay justice.
The fact that he convinced his Mormon ward that he was innocent, even after being found guilty of multiple murders, is just wild. It shows how charismatic he was, how good he was at twisting people's perceptions.
It's crazy, right? It shows how powerful belief can be and how a charismatic personality can sway people, even when there's so much evidence against them. We want to believe the best in people, and that can make us vulnerable to manipulation, especially from someone as skilled as Bundy.
And we can't forget about how the media played into Bundy's story. He became a huge media sensation, and all that attention just fed his ego and his need for control. He loved being in the spotlight and used it to manipulate his image and control how people saw him.
That's the tricky thing about the media and serial killers. It's important to inform the public and warn them about the dangers. But there's also the risk of making these guys famous and turning them into heroes. It's a tough line to walk, and we got to be careful about sensationalizing these cases.
You're right. It's all about balance. Informing people without glorifying the killers. Finding that sweet spot.
Bundy's case really shows the importance of thinking critically and not believing everything you see or hear. Just because someone seems charming or trustworthy doesn't mean they are. We need to be cautious and really think about the information we're given.
It's a lesson we can apply to every part of our lives, not just when dealing with potential criminals. We need to think critically all the time, especially with all the information thrown at us these days. A lot of it's designed to manipulate us,
Absolutely. We need to be discerning, to question what we think we know, and be aware of how easily we can be manipulated. We can't just accept everything we're told. We need to think for ourselves and evaluate the information we receive.
Great point. One thing that really stuck with me from all these cases is how planned and premeditated everything was. These weren't just spur-of-the-moment crimes. They were calculated, precise, like they were following a script.
That's one of the hardest things to wrap your head around, right? The level of detachment, the lack of empathy, the ability to just switch off their emotions and treat their victims like objects. It's almost inhuman.
It's like they're operating on a totally different moral level. Like the rules of society don't apply to them. They've made their own rules, their own twisted sense of right and wrong to justify what they do.
And that's what makes them so dangerous. They can blend in, act normal, while they have these dark, violent urges. They can be anyone, anywhere, which makes them incredibly difficult to catch.
It's a sobering reminder that evil can look like anyone, and we need to stay alert, trust our gut, and never underestimate the darkness that can exist in people.
Well said. We have to be aware of that potential for darkness, but we also have to remember that there's good out there too. People who care, who want to help, and who are fighting to make the world a better place. We can't let the darkness win.
We've spent a lot of time talking about these guys, like really getting into their heads, their motivations, how they did what they did. But, we got to remember the victims too. These weren't just names on a list. They were real people with families, friends. Their lives were cut way too short.
So true. It's easy to get caught up in the psychology of the killer, trying to figure out the why and how. But we can't forget about the human cost of it all. The impact reaches so many people.
Think about Shanann Watts, for example. A loving wife and mother, so excited about her baby boy on the way, Nico. And her little girls, Bella and Cece. Just kids. Their lives were stolen, and that loss, it's just incalculable.
And the families of Dahmer's victims? A lot of them were young men of color who were already marginalized. Nobody really noticed when they disappeared, which is why Dahmer was able to keep killing for so long. It's heartbreaking, It shows how inequality makes certain groups more vulnerable to these kinds of predators.
It's a tough reality to face. And then there are the survivors, like Harold Arench, who was kidnapped by Bundy but managed to escape. The trauma of that, the scars it leaves, it can stay with you forever.
Her story and the stories of other survivors really highlights how important it is to support victims of violence. They need to know they're not alone, that there's help out there, and that they can heal.
Absolutely. And that support has to continue, even after the immediate crisis is over. These people may struggle with PTSD, anxiety, depression, all sorts of things for years. They need access to therapy, counseling, support groups.
It's a good reminder that the impact goes way beyond any physical harm. Emotional and psychological wounds can be just as bad, maybe even worse, and they need a lot of care and attention.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the minds of these infamous killers, what are some of the big takeaways for our listeners? What have we learned from these cases that can help us understand, maybe even prevent, future tragedies?
I think one of the most important things is to be aware. We need to learn about the signs of psychopathy, the warning signs that someone might become violent, and the resources that are out there for people who've been abused or traumatized.
We can't just assume these things won't happen in our own communities or to people we know. We have to be vigilant, trust our gut, and speak up if something seems wrong.
Another big takeaway is addressing childhood trauma and promoting mental health. A lot of these killers had really rough childhoods filled with abuse, neglect, or some other kind of trauma. If we can step in early and give them the support and resources they need, maybe we can stop some of them from going down that dark path.
It's not about letting them off the hook for what they did. It's about realizing that early intervention can make a real difference. It's about breaking that cycle of violence and making the world safer for everyone.
And lastly, I think it's important to remember that these guys were able to operate for so long because they were so good at deception. They knew how to blend in, how to seem harmless and trustworthy. They were like chameleons, changing to fit their surroundings and manipulating people to get what they wanted.
That's why it's so important to be smart, to question what we believe, and not be fooled by appearances. We got to think critically, evaluate information, and watch out for anyone who seems a little too good to be true.
Exactly. We're bombarded with information all the time, so it's more important than ever to be critical of what we see and hear. We have to develop our critical thinking skills, learn to question everything, and be aware of how easily we can be manipulated.
That's some good advice. Well, this has been a tough one, but definitely insightful. We went deep into some dark places in the human mind, and I think we learned some valuable lessons about evil, about awareness, and the need for compassion and support for victims of violence.
Absolutely. As we go forward, let's keep these lessons in mind. Let's remember the victims, support those who survived, and work towards a safer and more just world for everyone.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.